I'm Diane Brigant, a Sister of St. Agnes from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and I'm also Professor Emerita of Biblical Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I'd like to share with you some reflections on some biblical passages that open up and throw light on certain themes that the Holy Father articulates in his document Laudato Si, the document in which he speaks about integral ecology. Very important, not just ecology, integral ecology. He says many things about science, about the natural world, about spirituality. He calls us to a kind of ecological spirituality, which is not the same as limited Jesus in me kind of spirituality, but it puts it in a broader context. So many things, he says. There are three themes that I make some comments on for lack of time, also not interest, but there's so many, you can only do a few. And these are themes that I think are basic for us in the way we understand what it means to be a human being. So it's fundamental to everything about us. The first of these themes is what the Holy Father refers to as radical anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism comes from two Greek words, anthropos meaning human, and centrism meaning centered. And in a certain sense, everything about us is anthropocentric. We can only understand anything from a human point of view. We value everything and evaluate everything from a human point of view. When you like something, it's because you like it. When we have certain kinds of entertainment, it's because we like it. So that's a human point of view, and it's natural, and what is natural is always good. The issue is not that it's bad. The challenge, of course, is when we like something, when we value something, when we look at something through a human point of view, do we evaluate it in terms of what it does for us? And if it doesn't give us pleasure, it's not valuable. If it doesn't improve us, it's not valuable. If it does not make us happy, it's not value. That's valuing things from an anthropocentric point of view, from a point of view that says our standards, our understanding, our evaluation is the only thing that matters, and nothing else matters except in terms of how it pleases us. That, of course, is what he would call radical anthropocentrism, or misguided anthropocentrism, or unlimited or negative anthropocentrism. You can't get away from anthropocentrism. The challenge is to realize that as human beings, we are limited. There are some things we will never be able to do as human beings, not simply that I cannot play the violin. It's something that we as human beings will never be able to do. We will never be able to understand certain things, regardless of how much money and how often we try to experiment. The problem, of course, is we don't know what these things are, and so we try and try and try. How many times do you try something and never are successful? When do you stop trying? I remember when I was a child, I had piano lessons. And I remember one time where I made a mistake, and so I started from the beginning. And my teacher, this was at a lesson, and my teacher said, when you are running to school and you fall down, you don't get up and go home and start over again. And maybe a clearer understanding, if a child in learning how to walk never got up after the first fall, that person would never be walking. So how often do you try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and try and succeed? And how do you know in what area you'll never succeed? So in a certain sense, we're supposed to try. We have unlimited desires, unlimited yearnings and interests. I will never, no one will ever be able to read everything they want to read. There's just not enough time, or there's just not enough time. Or it's something we will never be able to do. We don't have the talent for that. We don't have the strength for that. We don't have the intelligence for that. All right? So in a certain sense, that's limited anthropology or limited anthropocentrism. And there's nothing wrong with that. The issue, of course, is to find out what we can do, but also find out what we can't do and not presume I can do anything I put my mind to. That's one theme. So he speaks against anthropocentrism, and he points out because we refuse to admit our limitation and think everything has value only in terms of how it pleases us, he goes on and shows what happens with that kind of thinking. And what happens is polluted land, polluted water, polluted air, wars, all of that has to do with the natural world. A second theme is interconnectedness. And interconnectedness means we are all connected on a material or physical level. Now, in some ways, we know that. We know that we have features of our siblings because we all come from the same parents. We don't all look alike, but we have features of our siblings. Who hasn't said, oh, I see it in the eyes? So that's one way we are connected. Another way we are connected, we can share each other's blood. We can live off of each other's organs. So we are connected on that way of the same stuff, right? Of the same stuff. We also connected with the natural world, with each other, because we're all part of the natural world emotionally. And we love things. We love other people. We love our pets. You know, we love where we live. We're entranced by the moon and the stars. We love the warmth of the sun after a cold day or during a warm day. Some of us are sun worshipers. And not simply because we want the tan for Body Beautiful. We love the feel of the sun or the cool breeze in a hot day. So we're connected in that way emotionally. And also we are connected with each other on the level of a kind of spirituality. So there is an interconnectedness. Part of the interconnectedness, what I want to talk about a little bit later, is our totally dependence on the natural world. We desperately need it, because if we don't have it, we will not survive. There's much talk now about the possibility of colonizing Mars. I guess that's why they sent Matt Damon up ahead of us. But if you look at anybody who leaves Earth and goes into space, whether it's simply space or the moon or Mars, they take Earth with them because we cannot live without Earth. We are totally dependent on a certain amount of oxygen, certain combination within our oxygen. We are totally dependent on the kind of nutrition we need that we get from Earth. So if we go anyplace else, we will only survive if we live within Earth on that other place. So that's a kind of interconnectedness. There's also a kind of spiritual interconnectedness. And I want to speak this. Now, all of this could also be spiritual. The very fact that, as I said, physically we are connected with each other, and that should give us a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, regardless of the moral certitude or the moral culpability of those other people. We are connected to the tyrants of the world, not simply the suffering. We are physically connected with those who bomb others, who gas others. Like it or not, we are part of and they are part of us because we're made of the same stuff, made of the same stuff. In no way am I exonerating or uplifting tyrants of the world. I'm just saying, in a very real sense, they are our sisters and brothers. So we are interconnected in that way. We are also interconnected, you know, as I said, on the spiritual level. Now, all of this can also be spiritual, depending upon the religious insight that we have. We can see that interconnectedness as something from God, as we believe everything is from God. All right? So we can see it on that level. We can also see it on a purely spiritual level, which means a theological level. So, on the one hand, we see how we are totally dependent, because we're talking about interconnectedness here. We are totally dependent on the natural world. It is not dependent on us. In a certain sense, if the rest of the natural world, and just that articulation, rather than saying the natural world, we got to remember, we're the natural world as well. So if you want to talk about that which is not human, call it the rest of the natural world. In a certain sense, we are totally dependent. It is not dependent on us. But there is something, or some situation in a certain sense, where we will see that it is, in a certain sense, dependent on us. And that's what I want to talk about now. There is a passage in the book of Leviticus. It's found also in other places, but this is in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. Now, most people don't read Leviticus. It's not it's not an exciting story. It's not a story. It may have a basic storyline, but it's a collection. What we find in Leviticus is a collection of law. And this, of course, the story would suggest this is all the law that Moses received on Mount Sinai. If that would be the case, he would have been up on the top of that mountain for years. It's really more like a library shelf. You go to a library and all of the works of one author are together. Or if you go into a library, all of the books on law are together. In a certain sense, that's what we find in Leviticus. Laws that appeared, were legislated at one time in Israel's history, are simply added to this shelf. And they're added in a certain sense, they're connected, I should say, by themes. Not always by chronological unfolding, but by themes. So you have themes about blood. Blood which is not just messy, but powerful. Powerful. And you don't tamper with blood. And you don't touch anyone who has lost her or his blood, because you become ritually unclean. No morality involved. Well, there is one dimension of morality. You are responsible to help that person. But if you help them, you might become ritually unclean. And if you're ritually unclean, you cannot officiate in ritual for a certain length of time. And then you go and show yourself to the priest. There's a little ceremony, and then you are once again ritually clean. The average person doesn't read a story like that, because the average person usually uses the scriptures for prayer. And that's not an exciting topic to pray about. So when we look at Leviticus, what I'm going to look at, the theme that I'm going to look at here is not blood. The theme is time. It's a question of time. In the book of Leviticus, we're talking about the Sabbath year. Now, most people know about the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day, we say, is the day of rest. That's wonderful. How many people rest on the Sabbath? Sometimes you get up earlier to go to an early Mass. And why do you want to go to an early Mass? You want to go to an early Mass because Sunday becomes a catch-up day. And I'm not talking about a condiment. You're catching up on the work you didn't get done the rest of the week. So we in this society do not observe the Sabbath in the same way as past societies or past eras, even in our society. I remember when I was quite young, that there was a new super store that was opening up in the city where I was living. Kopp's. I don't know if anybody knows about Kopp's. It was an earlier form of Walmart that sold everything. And when they showed what their days were, their operating days, the days and the times they were open, there was a big uproar from all of the churches, all the Christian churches, and of course the synagogue in the city, that these people were not observing the rest on Sabbath. It was not to be opened. It was not to be opened because nobody should be required to work, and shopping was not supposed to be done on the Sabbath. So this almost sounds primitive to some people, but it was a way of showing this is a different day. And something on this day is special. And I think most of us have lost that understanding. We have not simply done away with certain practices. We have not replaced them with more meaningful practices in our own day and age. Not unlike what many Roman Catholics have suffered since the Second Vatican Council. There were some priests and bishops, and certainly many people, who at the time of the council said Devotion, we should put aside devotion. Devotion, which was, there used to be novenas to the Blessed Mother or to anybody. Novenas. Many parishes stopped novenas. Many parishes stopped Our Lady of Perpetual Help on Tuesday, 7:30. That's when we had it in our parish. They stopped that. Many parishes stopped devotions. I'm not finding fault with that. What I found fault with is they didn't replace it with anything. What people now did was study Scripture, which of course I'm a biblical theologian. I would want that. But people need to express it in a kind of ritual. And that is why a newer generation, a younger generation, when they want to express it in ritual, they go back to the old devotions. So it's not uncommon that Ways of the Cross or novenas is very popular with the younger generation. And those of us who had it in the past think they're conservative. I don't think that's the right evaluation. I think, it's a kind of practice they don't have, so they reach back into history and take one they know.
You have heard the traditional Veni, Creator Spiritus, Come, Creator Spirit song. We do not know the author of this song. It is an invocation to the Holy Spirit, and it is sung in the Catholic Church during the liturgical celebrations of the Feast of the Pentecost. It is also sung during the ordinations of priests and bishops and at some solemn events. It is such a heavenly feeling and experience when we listen to it being sung in Gregorian chant. Father Mike Manning has written a booklet to understand this great song of praise. He takes the English translation of the song and explains it in detail, but in plain language. It will surely help you understand and pray with this song in praise of the Holy Spirit. We want you to have a copy of this booklet.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also order it through our website. Come, Holy Spirit, enlighten our minds and hearts.
So we go back then to the whole question of the Sabbath. We know what Sabbath day is. There are two different versions of that story of God saying they should observe the Sabbath. One of them is found in Exodus, where the reason for observing the Sabbath is, let's look at the other one in Deuteronomy. There's one in Exodus and there's one in Deuteronomy. And the one in Deuteronomy, which is older than the one in Exodus, will say, remember that God created the Sabbath. That God created the Sabbath. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And the other one is, remember that God created the world and then rest. So there are two traditions about why you observe the Sabbath. But why do you observe the Sabbath? Maybe Sabbath year will give us a little bit more understanding of what Sabbath means. And that's what I want us to look at. Now one would think, what does this have to do with dependence on earth? Just listen. This is Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 7. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, let the land too keep a Sabbath for the Lord." So the people are to observe the Sabbath, but so is the land. Listen. For 6 years you may sow your field, and for 6 years prune your vineyard, gathering in their produce. But during the 7th year of the land, it shall be a complete rest, a Sabbath for the Lord. So it's rest not only a day, but a whole year. You may not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. The aftergrowth of harvest you shall not reap. Nor shall you pick the grapes of your untrimmed vines in this year of Sabbath rest for the land. While the land has its Sabbath, all its produce will be food equally for you yourself, for your male and female slaves, for your hired help, and the tenants who live with you, and likewise for your livestock and for the wild animals on your land. So it is the land that is to rest, and everything is to rest. No work is intended. No work is allowed. There's another passage that we find where it's you are not to work, nor your son or daughter, nor the free man who works in your house, male or female, nor your slaves, male or female, nor your animals. Now, why all of that numeration? Because sometimes when the owner doesn't work, everybody else does the work. So the only one to work or to rest is the owner. So it says you and your children. And that is so that nobody rests, nor your slaves, nor your animals. So the issue has to do with work. Just as, regardless of its Exodus or Deuteronomy, for the Sabbath day, we are not to work. What's wrong with work? Now, it says that God rested, and then, of course, sometimes people say because God was tired. That's lovely, but it's not good theology. What's wrong with work? So no work is to be done. On the one hand, I'm talking here about the land rest. So it's called land Sabbath. So the land is not to work. It's not to be worked, and the land is not to work. Because again, thinking of the metaphor, the land has to work, it has to be doing something in order to produce. So there's to be no work done. Why not? That might be good to allow a land to lie fallow. That might be good agricultural practice. But if one land or field is left fallow, the other ones are producing, so you're not with nothing. That might also mean if we know next year is the Sabbath year, this year we work harder so we can store up. But still, it's the Sabbath year, no work is to be done. Again, I ask, what's wrong with work? I want to suggest the issue with work is we think we are the ones who are doing it. We think we are the ones who are doing it. When in fact, it gets along quite nicely without us because God is the one who is covering it. God is the one who oversees. God is the one who produces. Now again, I realize this is all metaphor, but the thinking behind it is very important. It is to remind us that as much as we do, and they're talking about land, it's an agricultural people. As much as we do, and as successful as we are not the ones who are in charge of everything. It is the way Israel remembers that it is God who takes care of things. In a certain sense, if you want to find out how important you are in whatever work you do, retire. And you find out it goes on quite nicely without you. And you can be quite quickly forgotten. It's very difficult for human beings frequently to do, to deal with that. It's one thing to retire and spend the rest of your life on the yacht. But it's another thing, to retire and maybe the first short time, you get the rest that you haven't had for 50 years. But then you ask yourself, what can I do? Because there is within human beings the desire to do. Work is not a burden. What do they say? Find something you love and you will never be working, which means you're enjoying what you're doing. And I realize that some work is drudgery. But our goal, our dream, is to do something we really want to do. And we'll, in a certain sense, knock ourselves out to be able to do it. Not simply to be successful, to do it. Because as Koheleth or Ecclesiastes will tell us, the joy of doing something is not in the accomplishment. The joy of doing it is in doing it. In doing it. How do you know it's a good meal? When do you know it's a good meal? Not when you finished eating, while you're eating, while you're doing it. It is the doing, it is the painting, it is the joy of expressing oneself, the joy of singing, of being a singer or some kind of a musician is while you're doing it. You're happy when there's an applaud, but you're done. And then you're done until you have another gig. Then you're done. So it is the joy in doing it. So getting back to the question of work, the issue is not work in itself. The issue is our attitude toward how important we are in the world. Now, in a certain sense, every human being is important. Every group of people is important. But how important? When we think that the world will not survive without us, that is radical anthropocentrism. All right? That is radical anthropocentrism. So when we talk about, in a very real sense, when we talk about interdependence, clearly we are totally dependent on aspects of the natural world. And the natural world, in the same way, for survival, is not totally dependent on us. However, once we accept our privileged responsibility of being image of God, which means that we function on earth as God's representative, as God's ambassador. All right? When we accept that, that means we have a responsibility for earth. And then earth is dependent on our faithfulness to that responsibility. And when we do not accept that responsibility of caring for the earth, of being students or stewards of the earth, that's when we suffer from the destruction of earth and all of the elements of earth. So in a certain sense, there is an interdependence, but it's a different kind of interdependence. It is the kind of interdependence of, in both cases, our dependence on the natural world and its dependence on our responsibility, on our righteousness. And then I leave. Are we faithful to that, is the question. Are we witnesses of God's jurisdiction and God's beautiful earth? And how are we functioning in it?